Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Kent Jenkins. He was a political reporter, a journalist at the Washington Post, an institution in Washington, D.C., now, of course, owned by Jeff Bezos, but Kent worked there many a moon ago when it was not owned by Jeff Bezos. Kent is now a communications consultant. He's a regular attendee at our FO meetup at the National Press Club, where he has enlightened us on many a subject. And today we are discussing the forbidden C word, class in America. Welcome to FO Podcasts, Kent.
Atul, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you, Kent, for making the time. So, Kent, your personal story ties into the story of class in America. And for many who live outside America, especially if they live in places like China, India, Kenya, Nigeria, or even, say, places in Europe like Italy or Estonia, they do not realize how class does matter in the US. They think of class as in class in the UK, where I studied. They think of Downton Abbey, they think of Etonians, they think of Oxbridge people like me, and so on and so forth. And so tell us your story, and tell us the story of class in America.
Well, Atul, again, thanks for having me, and thanks for actually taking on this subject. This is a very dangerous and un-American thing that we're doing here, actually saying the word class, because as you will search far and wide in any American political discussion here, anybody utter that word. It's just something that we as Americans, like to think of de Tocqueville seeing us as strong, independent pioneers and rugged individualists, and we don't like to think of ourselves as being shaped by our backgrounds and environments. But certainly in my case, I know that class and issues related to class have been one of the defining things that I've dealt with personally. And as a political journalist and as someone who has spent a lot of time around Washington, I think our national political debate right now is really being shaped to a tremendous degree by issues that are related to class. And when I watch that and engage with those issues, my personal journey really, colors my view of politics and what's happening in the country at large, and I hope informs it a bit.
So tell us, because the first time we met, we immediately got off to a great start. We got on like a house on fire. And one of the things we did discuss that spring, I believe it was spring, fine spring day sitting in Virginia, was about where you grew up, how you ended up in Washington, D.C., how you were the only person who sounded like the way you do, and so on and so forth. So tell us your story.
Yeah, I'm what sociologists refer to as a class migrant, which means I grew up blue collar and ended up in a white collar profession in a white collar environment.
So I'm an immigrant and you're a migrant, class migrant.
Right, something like that. And we can talk about yours. And it's extremely interesting that you and I have talked a lot about the fact that we literally grew up on different sides of the world at different ends of the class scale, and yet I think one of the things that you and I have really found in common is how much of a factor class has been for us personally and for the societies that we grew up in.
I mean, look, I just have to open my mouth and people know precisely where I am in the Indian social pantheon. And yes, they make assumptions that are blatantly untrue. I come from dispossessed aristocracy. My grandfather died when my father was young, he was still in school. My father grew up, I shouldn't say in abject poverty, but certainly in difficult circumstances. There was no money to go around. Family heirlooms were sold off to educate the boys in the family. There were 4 of them. And yes, all of them did well. My eldest uncle was a physicist. My second uncle, my late uncle, he's dead. My second uncle, whom I worship the the ground he walked on. He was an extraordinary man, a great influence in my life. Narendra Bahadur Singh. He was a military man, an eye surgeon, exuded class, exuded panache, movie star looks, just an extraordinary human being, retired as a professor of the Armed Forces Medical College. The third gentleman was an inventor engineer. He died very young. There is a history of early deaths in the family. I hope I skipped that tradition. Although I do get many threats. But going to the class, we were the dispossessed class, so we didn't have the benefits of people with money. But because we spoke Hindi in the right accent, and of course my mother is a Hindi, Sanskrit, and Bangla scholar, because I speak English the way I do, because our parents really pushed us. Both my brother and I won scholarships to Oxford. Both of us debated for Oxford. So we certainly have the advantage that when we open our mouths, no one considers us to be A, stupid, and B, entirely uncouth.
And I, on the other hand, the moment I open my mouth, I am regularly in conversations where I can watch, if someone doesn't know me, that I get two syllables out and I lose about 20 or 25 IQ points just because of the way that I speak. It will come as no surprise to anybody listening to this that I am a Southerner. I'm from a small town in the South. I grew up in a little town west of Charlotte, North Carolina, in the Appalachian foothills. It was a cotton mill town. Back when there was a textile industry in the United States, my home county was the center of it. Unlike your family, all four of my grandparents were at work in a cotton mill before they turned 16. They raised my mom and my dad to graduate from high school because they wanted them to do better than them. And my mom and my dad were tremendously bright, able people and had opportunities to go to college, but just in the town they were in, they elected not to. It was a decision that I think both of them regretted profoundly for the rest of their lives. And so from the time, I have no memories of not thinking that I was going to go to college, because in a town where not that many of my high school classmates went away to school, my parents had simply made it an article of faith that I was going to do that, and I did. And through a long series of degrees and newspaper jobs, by the time I was about 30, I ended up as a political reporter and editor at the Washington Post. And I can tell you that it was, I think there were literally hundreds of people on the Post staff while I was there. To the best of my recollection, I think during the 10 years that I spent there were maybe two other people in that newsroom who had accents like mine. It just simply was not something that was normal. And I think that you find out very quickly the phrase class migrants comes from, again, sociologists who looked at this. And I still have a foot in both worlds. I have wonderful, loving family who are great folks that are still very much in my hometown. I'm kind of the only person that went very far away. And so I spend a lot of time back home, and I spend a lot of time, obviously, here in D.C. And I just tell you that it really can give you a bit of cultural whiplash in the sense of, what you're dealing with, the issues you're dealing with. I mean, the way people talk, the way people dress, the way people eat, the way they worship if they go to church. Certainly the way they vacation, where they go to school. It's just fundamentally very, very different. And I think negotiating that, feeling like that you have a foot in two different worlds is a bit of a balancing act. And I think what you're seeing right now in American politics play out is two political parties trying to do a bit of the same balancing act. Donald Trump has been very, very, very successful in peeling off working class voters from the Democratic Party, and not just white working class voters, but in this last election, 2024, I think to the great alarm of Democrats, he peeled off a significant number of Hispanic and black working class voters. And there are signs that in this most recent election, in this past, last month, in New Jersey and in Virginia, that those gains may not be permanent. But
two women got elected,
yes, right.
And New York City elected its first
Democratic Socialist
and a Muslim. Who wears his religion a bit too much on his sleeve, in my view. But hey ho, there we go.
But you have, I think, the two major political parties in this country engaged in trying to understand and navigate those differences, because again, as political reporter, I don't think this is a controversial assessment, the voters that decide elections in this country and on a national basis in the states that matters and nationally are people, for the most part, who are middle income, lower middle income, blue collar voters, and their allegiances, which are switching back and forth, have been incredibly important in the last couple of elections, and will be going forward. And so I listen to a lot of what I hear coming from both parties and kind of shake my head and wonder where they're coming from.
So let's take a step back. Look, when it comes to New York City, it was a foregone conclusion that once Zohran Mamdani won the primary, he was going to win.
Right.
That was basically because of the simple reason that most cities on the East Coast are very much dyed in deep blue. They are Democrat.
Right.
New Jersey, of course, is also more or less a Democratic state, although the Republicans have been doing better, but you had a decent candidate. And of course, in Virginia, you had a retired CIA officer who made it, also a woman. Both New Jersey and Virginia elected women. But these states are not really massively working class states, whereas parts of Virginia are, but Northern Virginia is now people who work for the federal government, really.
Right.
And when we talk to the broader working class, what is it that Donald Trump got right in 2016 and 2024? Because as you know, on June 28th June, if those of you listening are British, 2016, I wrote The Age of Donald Trump,
right,
which you've read, but not very many people have. And I could feel that Donald Trump was coming to power. I could feel that the zeitgeist was changing. And as I was going through small town Americana, which I did a lot, as you know, I've driven across this country 4 times. I've gone south, I've gone north, I've gone to Michigan, I've gone to Mississippi. And I could feel that the use of the word deplorables by Hillary Clinton, the domination of Ivy League, bright, shiny young things in her campaign, all of this would come to bite her in the rear. And it did. And I could see signs in 2024 as well that the Biden campaign wasn't working and Kamala Harris was a terribly flawed candidate. So the writing was on the wall. And the Democratic Party arguably lost the working class a while ago by becoming a touch too elitist and trying to go for identity politics in terms of sexual identity, LGBTQ+, arguably needed for overcoming long-standing discrimination, but perhaps overplaying it a bit, and at the same time going gung-ho for minorities and playing the minority card. But in the process, those who lost their jobs when factories moved to Mexico or to China felt underrepresented. And so it paints us a picture of what Donald Trump got right in 2016 and 2024, when black working class men and some women, but mainly men, and Hispanic or Latino working class men, and indeed many Latinas, voted for him. Over to you.
I think several. I mean, I think first of all, the first thing he did right was he showed up. I mean, he physically went to places that a lot of Democratic candidates did not go.
Mm-hmm. So he showed up in small towns,
and when he showed up, he put on a show. I mean, those rallies, if you look at 2016 and even 2020, particularly in the South, politics has always had an entertainment aspect to it. Political speeches were not only were supposed to move people and be entertaining, and his career as a television performer enabled him to like get a crowd going. Now, you may find a lot of what he said, a lot of the way he did it repulsive, but he wasn't looking down his nose at the audience.
So he is a modern day P.T. Barnum.
No question about it. And whereas I think a lot of Democrats look like if you put them in an environment like that, they feel like they need to wear surgical scrubs and a mask so they don't get, contaminated by what's around them. And that kind of that kind of condescension, I think more than anything, that I can just tell you that from personal experience, that we Southerners, have been looked down on since, for always and certainly since the end of the Civil War. And we kind of have an extra gene that we can detect any amount of condescension and being dismissed and looked down on. It's just something that the moment you detect it, it cancels everything that comes after that. And look, I think that Democrats do a number of things enormously well, and you cannot argue that people who go to college and elite colleges and get degrees are not able, accomplished people. But to dismiss people who choose different lives and who choose to stay in their hometowns and who have really rewarding, rich lives, but that are not the choices you made, and to simply assume the worst of them, well, you're not going to get their votes. You just aren't. That's not the way things work. And so I think particularly in 2016, that unfortunately was the case. I think Joe Biden was able to win in large part because, whatever you think of it, the guy who described himself as middle class Joe, wasn't kidding. He did kind of come from a very middle to working class background in Delaware. And, he didn't mind being around those voters that were in the middle or lower middle of the economic.
He's like those folks. I mean, I'd met him just once when I had come to America when in the early days. And this is the early 2010s, probably 2010 or 2011. I met him very briefly. No. Yeah, actually, yes, that is when I met him. He was vice president then. And we shook hands and he cracked a joke. And I said, oh, I know X who worked for you. And he said, well, you must have heard. And X has said lots of things about you. And he said, all bad things. And I said, precisely. And he is likable and he likes people.
And all kinds of people. I mean, if you ever saw Joe Biden standing up at an event with union workers, he was in his element. He just clearly, the body language, he understood folks, who what's the phrase that people like to use, who showered after work, not before work. And he liked being around them, and he valued what they did, and he valued their support. And I think that made a huge difference. I think that's not the case, particularly in the national political sphere. I think far too many Democrats give off a very different vibe. And I would hasten to say, by the way, that I don't think that's true when you get outside the Beltway. I think you can look at a lot of states that Democrats lost in 2024, and you can see sitting governors and sitting senators who win statewide, who are, have a very different feel in a very different appeal. They're able to communicate well with a much broader spectrum of voters. And again, I think that the big, one of the big debates that's going to play out in the Democratic Party over the next couple of years is that the way the party's going to go, or are we just going to try and double down on turning out more voters that are high? Do we think we can find more new voters who are more like us, quote unquote? And I think that's an unresolved question. I'm not so sure that I think that the strategy of just trying to find more people like us is a winning political strategy.
So let's break it down. We know what class means in the UK. I studied British social history at the University of Oxford as one of my subjects in philosophy, politics, and economics. And I had the great J.P. Dunbabin as my tutor. I had Michael Hart as my tutor. And class in the UK is upheld by language, accent, culture. But really, if you want to drill down to it, you can move up the class ladder. In fact, you can be Rishi Sunak, you can go to Winchester, you can be the son of immigrants, and you speak in that posh accent. And really, class is determined to a great degree by which school you went to. And if you managed to go to private schools, they're for some strange reason called public schools.
Yeah.
Then your life trajectory in the upper echelons of society is guaranteed unless you snort too much cocaine. So class is very much very easily discernible in the UK. It's the schools you went to, then did you go to Oxbridge, do you speak in the posh accent, and so on and so forth. And social mobility, which is jumping up from one class to another, has historically been hard, although now apparently it's easier than the US. And if you go to the rest of Europe, class is not the same big deal. The UK historically, after the revolutions ended, became the most class-divided society in recent times. Of course, if you go back pre-French Revolution, then the UK was a far more fluid society where merchants could rise up and others could rise up, and they would reform. France, of course, couldn't, and therefore France had this unending cycle of revolution, counter-revolution. You get the Republic, followed by the Bourbon Kingdom, followed by another kingdom, followed by another republic, another empire, and so on and so forth. And France is on its fifth republic. But going back to Europe, class is very clear. Explain to me how class works in America.
I think it's again, it's a bit like Potter Stewart's definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. It's a mixture to varying degrees, I think, of economics, education, and culture.
Okay, but you don't have the royalty. You don't have Prince Harry. You don't have Prince William. So it's not quite the landed aristocracy that Europe had. No,
and I don't want to suggest for a moment that it's that way, but what you see, and again, I am the career that I've had, and some of the things that I've done are not things that my father would have imagined that he would ever do, and there has been enormous mobility in this country, but what you find out, or at least what I found out very quickly, is my parents were adamant in saying, "Son, you're going to go to college," and I did.
So, but college determines class in this country.
I think yes and no. I think particularly if you go to any kind of a selective college, not just
so Glenn Carl, my co-author, the WASP, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestant with 9 ancestors on the Mayflower, is your equivalent of the English.
He is Boston. He is a Brahmin. He is a Brahmin.
And he's a Boston Brahmin.
And I think what even in for some of us, even if it's not Ivy League, most states like North Carolina, Virginia, others will have like a flagship state university that's somewhat selective. And, in North Carolina, if you went, or Virginia or those states, if you went to that university, that's something that stands out. That creates economic opportunities for you. Now, where class, I think, really gets tricky in the U.S., and certainly it was an adventure that I'm still on in my life, is all the habits, the way daily life was structured in my hometown, Cherryville, North Carolina, is not much like the way life is structured here in Washington, D.C. And, the wardrobe is different. The language is different. The custom, all manner of customs are different. And if you're born,
you go hunting and fishing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am, there's an old joke, not mine, that where I grew up, summer is a noun, not a verb. We do not summer at places. It is a season. And there are many different ways, but I know that once I worked for a couple of years after I graduated from the University of North Carolina. I worked for a couple of years in North Carolina, and then I went to Chicago and got a master's at Northwestern. And after that, I left the state and ended up in D.C. And I found out very quickly and after working at the Post, I've worked at, I worked for a global tech company for a while. I worked for a, one of the largest global communications agencies. And, when you have people from all over the place with different customs, different, different traditions they bring to it, you have to figure out very, very quickly that the things that work for you in a town that was largely a blue-collar industrial town, where there were folks that owned the mills and folks that worked there, the set of rules that you get taught to survive in that environment aren't going to serve you very well in these other environments. That doesn't mean that the folks that I grew up with were wrong. It means that they were responding to the environment they were in. And once that environment changes, the rules change very, very, very significantly. And they don't hand you an instruction manual that says, oh, you need to be able at this cocktail party to, you can bet your life that a good portion of the conversation at the cocktail party is going to be people comparing stamps on their passports. Where they traveled and, this. And travel is a wonderful broadening thing, but it is one of the ways that just, if you're around people with college degrees and a little bit of disposable income, that's kind of one of the ways that it's part of the secret handshake, that we all get along. Well, when I was a kid, a 3-hour drive to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina for a few days was vacation. That did not get a stamp on the passport. And you sort of had to figure out how to get from point A to point B on that scale. And there are just dozens and dozens of little things like that if you're born into them, I think it's what the sociologists call cultural capital. If you're born into them and they come naturally to you, that's a huge advantage. And if they are things that you have to learn, then it's just going to take you a little while to catch up, if you do.
Brilliant. So you're telling me that education matters, the college you go to matters, what you do matters, how you speak matters, your daily life habits matter, travel matters, and generally, perhaps, the worldview that you have and the habits and the mannerisms and your very persona, that matters. Yeah. That's a full picture, really, and we now have some idea of what class means in America. Now, let me go back to Harvard, since, of course, Glenn went to Harvard, and I visit Cambridge off and on. One of the things that has struck me at Harvard, and I'd love to hear more from you on this issue, is how it is very diverse in terms of race, perhaps religion, but in terms of class, Harvard doesn't seem very diverse to me. And the cost of admissions consultants for all Ivy League institutions in America has become so prohibitive, running in the thousands of dollars. And even before that, the development of private schools is echoing the UK, the mothership, Albion. Of course, there's a famous book called Albion's Seed.
Right.
How do you pronounce? Is it?
I think it's Albion. I know that book because my town was settled, but my region was settled by Scots, Irish, and Welsh and Germans, and that is one of the books that explains a lot about the environment I grew up in.
Yeah. So of course, the early immigrants were all from the British Isles. So we are starting to see what I have often called the beginning of the old worldification of America.
Yeah.
And tell us how you see that trend, and because in your own family, you can say that that trend is personified in your son, who did go to.
Sure.
He didn't go to a public or a government school or public school, as you would say. He went to a public school in the British sense.
Yes, my son went to what we liberal Democrats insist on calling an independent school.
I see.
Because we can't bring ourselves to use the word private school. God forbid that something be private and excluding people. But it was one of the schools here in Washington, D.C., where, a lot of president's kids and other people like that had gone. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for him. And the kids that he went to school with were, indeed pretty remarkable kids. But
and a lot of them went to the Harvards, the Yales, the Princetons. It's a feeder school.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. They were, regardless, they did that. But one of the things that I've often, that I remember very well, and it sort of talks to them, is literally, when I was a kid at my public high school, certainly for my family, we lived 30 or 40 miles from Charlotte. A trip to Charlotte was kind of a big deal for us. We didn't go that far that often. It's just, you kind of stayed around the people that you knew and did what you were there. Well, full stop. I am now, at right about the time my son graduated high school. I was working for a company in a communications consultancy, and I had reason to go to Brussels because we had business that was pending before the European Union. And I went over several, and on my first trip to Brussels, I literally, dropped my bag in my hotel and thought, well, I'll just check out the fitness center to see what it's like. And literally, I hadn't been in Brussels for an hour. And when I walked down to the fitness center, as I reached for the doorknob, the door swung open in front of me, and I looked up, and there coming out of the fitness center was one of my son's high school classmates' father. He was an international trade lawyer who had business in Brussels at the European Union. And I was, oh, hi, how are you? And in fact, he had been there before, and we ended up having just a wonderful afternoon where we kind of walk around town. He showed me the sights at dinner. But I've often thought about the fact that that is literally an environment where you can travel to Brussels and, kind of have a sort of a small PTA meeting for your son's high school class.
PTA is Parents Teachers
Association. You can you kind of bump into people in places like Brussels, and trust me, in my hometown, we don't bump into each other in Brussels. That's not how it works. And that's just one of the many things that, it's now. I will also tell you that the warmth and the value of community in my hometown, the degree to which people that are deeply, deeply supportive of each other. And, we talk about community in bigger cities. It's just very different. I mean,
I mean, that's the story. Sorry to interrupt.
no,
That's the story of humanity. All of urbanization leads to greater possibilities and greater freedoms and individual choices. But if you read literature over the ages, it also leads to isolation, atomization, fragmentation, and a loss of a sense of belonging in community. That is the case whether you leave a village in India where everyone is very tight, and then you come to a Mumbai slum. That is the big difference between a village and a slum, and I've seen that in India. And if you take any auto or three-wheeler in Mumbai, they will tell you, we are here only for the money. We send money back home. A lot of them have sent their children and wife back home. And this loss of community is a universal feature across urban centers all across the world, really.
It is, and again, that I think is one of the issues, again, writ large, that I think when you look at our political environment right now, that when you see, I think, the contest that's going on among Democrats and Republicans for swing voters, it's like, how do you, Republicans have been, I mean, the Republican Party has been engaged pretty much in a 50-year project that started with Richard Nixon in the 60s to split off lower middle income working class voters from the Democrats in the New Deal coalition. And they have stayed at it, through Nixon, through Reagan, through Lee Atwater and wedge issues in Bush, and up to Trump, and they've been very successful at it.
So let me stop you just a minute and tell our international listeners that the Republican Party was the party, or is the party, of Abraham Lincoln. The Republican Party was the party that abolished slavery. And indeed, the South used to be a Democratic stronghold, believe it or not.
Yes.
It is only the ending of segregation by Lyndon B. Johnson and shall we say, the defection of Strom Thurmond from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party that made the South a Republican stronghold.
And I certainly don't want to sugarcoat the role of race in all this. The role of race in splitting the Democratic Party has been enormous and enormously objectionable in a lot of ways. There's no question about that. I think what, as a result of that, and to your point, by the way, that again, I'm a baby boomer, and in my hometown, when I was growing up, I mean, literally the only Republicans I knew were, the family that owned the local bank and savings and loan and a couple of other people. It was that literally there was a phrase that you read in the newspapers all the time, that when the Democratic primary was held in the summer before the general election, that the results of the Democratic primary were, quote, tantamount to election.
So like New York City.
Yeah, exactly. They were that. Now exactly the reverse is true. It's overwhelmingly Republican. There are Democrats, but it is overwhelmingly Republican, and it was not. It certainly, race played an enormous role in, I think, disrupting the Democratic coalition. But there are also a lot of other issues. My hometown is a very religious place. Churches play an enormous role in the community. It's no secret that Democrats, are much less religious than society. You look at polls; they're not nearly as comfortable with organized religion. There are a lot of Democrats aren't nearly as comfortable with military service as Republicans. And where I'm from, military service is an honored tradition. And these are things that there are cultural issues that have kind of led us to where we are politically. And I think now you see a number of Democrats that have concluded, and certainly I share this belief, that on the trajectory we're on, Democrats simply can't win. national elections, and they've got to recalibrate. I mean, I do think that for a number of years, a lot of Democrats, particularly Democrats on the left wing of the party, were pretty comfortable to see, white working class voters go. They didn't mind. They thought they were kind of racist and just, not worthy. But I think that, again, when Donald Trump made inroads among Hispanic and black voters last year, it was a real wake up call. And I think you do see a lot of Democrats out there now who, particularly outside Washington, who are making real inroads in understanding and addressing these issues.
Yes, that is true. But even now, the brave new face of the Democratic Socialists is Zohran Mamdani, whose mother is a film director. That's why he was so good on social media, who went to a very Tony college called Bowdoin, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And his father is a professor at Columbia.
I was not aware that Bowdoin was a cradle of populism until I saw the New York mayoral race, but you learn things.
Oh, well, exactly. And that may fly in New York, and that rousing speech in which he quotes Nehru, the Brahmin socialist first prime minister of India, may all go down very well with the metropolitan elites. But as an American comedian noted, this will add fuel to the fire in many other states around the US. He is not a working class chap, no. And it just shows that the Democratic Party is increasingly at the top, the preserve of elites.
It is.
And this is where I have a story which which I told you earlier, and it's perhaps pertinent that I mention it briefly. I knew a student in Berkeley. I still know that student, who's no longer a student, from Berkeley. She is a fantastic Latina girl or woman now, young woman now, very polite, just wonderful human being, was extremely warm and kind to me. And she, and as you know, I taught briefly in Berkeley for a couple of years. She once met me in a very tearful state and said she was very sad and gutted and I asked her why, and she said she'd been volunteering for Hillary Clinton. This is 2016. And I said, well, that's great. And she said, well, she had suggested that the campaign do certain things in Hispanic areas for Latino and Latina voters, and one of the things she suggested was don't use Latinx because that simply doesn't fly. Spanish is a gendered language, and she got lectured to by a South Asian lady, a South Asian young woman, more or less the same age, maybe a year older or two, if at all. And this lovely lady, Pakistani American or Indian American, who knows, very patrician, had gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, one of the three, I forget. That's not the point. The institution is not the point. The point is, she told that this lady, who came from the community, whose votes they were going to ask for, did not realize what was important, was using something that was unjust. She turned into a woke warrior, and this poor Berkeley student felt berated, humiliated, and said, she felt really bad, but what could she say? After all, she had gone to a state school. And therein lies the crux of the problem with the Hillary Clinton campaign. It wasn't race that was the fault line. It was class. And her use of the word deplorables was, shall we say, a deplorably stupid mistake in her campaign.
It, I think, was a turning point in that campaign. And I would just echo, I think, sort of, Atul, my sort of version of that is, politics is not just about what you is not just about what you think. It's not even primarily, in my view, about what you think and what you know. It's about how you feel. It's about emotions, and it's about whether you recognize the person who's talking to you, whether you think they can understand you, get you, and what emotions they evoke, not just what logically you know. And one of the things that I will occasionally, again, because of some of the institutions that my son has been a part of, and so where I'll be out at a meeting somewhere, and someone will inevitably, and very piously invoke the phrase white male privilege. And look, intellectually, I understand that I'm a white male and that there are things that come easier to me because of that. I get that, and I know that that's true, and I don't dispute it, and it's wrong, and I want to do something about it.
Sure. I mean, look, if the two of us were to walk into a rough pub, and were that to be in the wrong part of town in a northern English rough suburb, you are less likely to get beaten.
Yeah, certainly. But there are certain advantages. Having said that, and I know that, and I accept it.
But exactly, but that's not the only kind of privilege.
No, and there's how I feel when I hear that, and how I feel, because inevitably, when I hear that, or not inevitably, but far more often than not, it comes from somebody who, from an upper middle class background, who's educated at elite institutions, and who will never in their lives work a job that requires them to wear a uniform, punch a time clock, or break a sweat. Well, before I had graduated college, I had worked in a cotton mill. I had worked on a construction crew. I'd worked as a janitor, and I'd spent a lot of summers loading tractor trailers as a stevedore. And when I look at some very earnest young person, who's had a pretty good life, lecturing me without a hint of irony or self-awareness about my privilege, I understand what my privilege is, but if you want to know how I feel down in the core of my Appalachian heart, it is like, just stop. Just really stop. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're talking about the outrage of privilege and the patronizing tone of democratic elites. I've been accused of being a self-hating Indian. I've been accused of being a lackey of British white imperialists. I've been accused of being a lackey of the CIA because I do a podcast with a Mayflower descendant, and so on and so forth. And the reality is, and my point was, that privilege is complicated, because a lot of kids who, let's say, the South Asian lady certainly had a more privileged life than the Latina from Berkeley any day. Her parents certainly either were doctors or engineers. She had wealth. Yes, I'm sure she was bright. But to assume that she knew better as to what to say and how to campaign when it came to a community whose language she did not know, leave aside understand, is the height of elite privilege. And that is what the new universities have bred. And you can see it and you can feel it. And the Democratic Party has certainly managed to get votes from the knowledge class, as you say, but has lost the working class. And that is something, me as an outsider, having seen class from up close in India, because remember, we are from the old aristocratic class. We fell out of favor. We fell out of fashion. And so a lot of people who went to private schools, the posh private schools, looked down on my brother and me as Hindi bhaiyas, because we spoke Hindi, which is, of course, the national language of India, but a lot of the elites in India don't even speak Hindi. I didn't go to St. Stephen's. I went to Lucknow University, so I was an idiot. Until I went to Oxford, and of course, then I was a genius.
It's amazing how much your IQ soared.
So, so I have been, and because I oppose the Indian elites, particularly the administrative elites, the Indian administrative service, the Indian police service, the colonial bureaucracy, I'm seen as a class traitor. So I'm ostracized in such a vicious manner that you wouldn't believe is possible. But this is not a sob story or anything. This is just an insight into I understand class because I fall into different classes or different definitions in different places. And it is complicated. Privilege is complicated. It is beyond race. Similarly, privilege is complicated. It is also beyond, in some ways, economics.
Yeah, and in my personal view too, I mean, it's just, look, Democrats are right to be outraged about racism, sexism, gender discrimination. These are all things that are wrong, and that the party has led the way.
We all agree there should be greater justice in society.
But if that is your sole focus, then I think what Democrats have found out the hard way over the last few elections, the numbers don't work. I mean, let's set aside what's right and wrong for a moment. You cannot build a coalition that is broad enough to win national elections if you go about it the way the Democrats have been doing it.
I don't want to get partisan. I'm not a partisan. I'm a journalist, so I cannot belong to any political party anyway. I have a legal obligation as long as I run Fair Observer. But more than that, an intellectual one, as a student of society and as an analyst of politics, and what I see is the Democrats play the populist card in trying to appeal to, say, the minorities. But in reality, they don't even want to listen to the minorities. The minorities are culturally conservative.
Right.
So when you say there should be unisex bathrooms, Muslim voters are not pleased.
No. And
Latina
nor are a lot of socially conservative Latino and black voters.
Exactly.
But in my, and again, not as an advocate, but sort of as a political reporter, political observer type person, my sort of shorthand for this is that, say what you will about the prescriptions that the Donald Trump has offered, blue collar voters. He has basically acknowledged their existence and said, here's what I'm going to do for you. At least this is what I say I'm going to do for you. I think that in shorthand, I think Democrats need to, if Democrats are going to compete effectively, they need to decide whether they want to be a cocktail party or a political party. Because at a cocktail party, you have folks who look alike and think alike and can make real nice conversation. And it's a very enjoyable occasion because everybody has a lot in common. But there are not enough of those people, I think history shows, to win national elections. And if you're going to win national elections, you need to basically find some people who you don't have everything in common with, but who you do share, you can make common cause with. And you ought to be able to get just as outraged about the lack of economic opportunity in rural America, about the opioid epidemic that decimated rural America, as you get outraged about some of these other issues. And if you can basically broaden that coalition, then I think there's a significant shift in the balance of political power in this country. And just speaking personally, what I would say, for me, the experience of moving out of my hometown and living at a lot of different places and being around a lot of different people, that many of which on the surface I don't have anything in common with, has in fact been one of the most enriching, wonderful things in my life. To find out, you sit down with people that you don't think you have anything in common with, and you just end up having these marvelous conversations because you find out you do. And I think that is something that that is something that in politics generally should not be lost on people. Is this there's a cynical reason for people to strike broad coalitions because you have to do that to win. But beyond the cynical reason, you just might find out you like people you don't think you're going to like, and that more than anything, I think, is the reason to just seek out people who aren't like you.
And perhaps invest in better schools, invest in better ladders of opportunity, and have a few working class leaders and not just people who went to private posh schools and fancy colleges. Yeah. That might be a start for all political parties. Yeah. I mean, let's not forget that the Republican Party has its own newfangled monarchical leadership and its own privilege of wealth. Yeah. And backing of billionaires, whilst the Democratic Party is funded by big corporates in Wall Street and until recently tech, the dominant tech billionaires. So if we have to move from an oligarchy, which unfortunately America seems to be turning into, to a democracy, we'll have to have more common men and common women in positions of power. Right. Brilliant. Kent Jenkins, thank you for your time.
Atul, thank you so much and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, sir. And those of you who've liked this podcast, make sure you leave us a review on whatever platform you're hearing us, whether it is Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube or Amazon. And make sure that you support independent non-profit journalism. After all, if you don't support us, you can go to Twitter, which is owned by Elon Musk, or you can go to Washington Post, which is now owned by Jeff Bezos. Both of which I would argue, as a scrappy entrepreneur, are not the most salubrious outcomes for society. On that note, we will see you anon.